Okay, can I see me?
Thank you.
Okay. All right, I think we're good to go. So, hi everybody. My name's Kristen Gallerneaux. I am the curator of communications and information technology at the Henry Ford Museum. And I'm very happy to be here hosting our very first THF Conversations. This is a new virtual series featuring leaders in the field discussing topics and trends relevant to the world we live in today. And what a strange one it is, right? So these sessions will be hosted and curated by the Henry Ford's experts and held over Zoom, because that's what we have now. THF Conversations is part of the hashtag We Are Innovation Nation virtual learning series. For those of you who are new to the Henry Ford, please be sure to check out our weekly events. These include things like live storytelling for the little ones with like STEAM focused books. We have innovation journeys led by our learning and engagement team. Every week the curators host Twitter Q&A sessions. And we also host young inventors from Invention Convention every week. And you can stay up to date with all of those things at the henryford.org Innovation Learning Virtual Series. I will drop a link in the chat in just a moment. But today, first, I want to introduce you to Josh Goldblum, who we have here today. Hey, Josh. What's up? And the format of today's talk is that following my intro, Josh will give a talk and I will disappear off the screen, and then we'll regroup on screen after his talk for a Q&A. So for everybody joining us, please feel free to drop questions into the Q&A function and we'll get to a few of those at the end. So Josh is the founder and CEO of Bluecadet, a really cool experience design agency that we've come to know very well over the last few years at the Henry Ford. Bluecadet has completed some really incredible projects for us, including an AI-enhanced interactive experience that captures how and why we collect, and it really exposes the connections between those objects that are often sort of just stored up in our brain as curators. There are projection walls, responsive digital columns, there's audio tours, and a really fun AR app that you can actually try out at home today if you choose to download the app. So, of course, just days out from the full launch of the completed Intersections of Innovation exhibit, we had to close to the public due to safety issues surrounding the spread of COVID-19. We are confident that we made the right decision, but trust me when I say that we have this really incredible new experience awaiting everybody as soon as it's safe for us to reopen. But I'm starting to wax nostalgic here. I really miss the museum. But today we're very lucky to have this opportunity to have this virtual talk with Josh. And just a little background on him: after studying for degrees in fine arts and English, Josh joined the Smithsonian as a new media specialist, which at that time was a very new kind of career in the dark days of early 2000s interactive web design. He went on to form Bluecadet in 2007, which has offices in both Philadelphia and NYC. And Josh formed an amazingly interdisciplinary team of people at Bluecadet who, I'm stealing this directly from your website, Josh, unite revolutionary innovations with a sense of human craftsmanship. And for anybody who's seen their experience design in person, you know that to be absolutely true. As an organization, they pride themselves on their work with cultural institutions, universities, and mission-driven organizations, places like the Smithsonian, Doctors Without Borders, National Geographic, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and now the Henry Ford. Josh's ability to mesh technological transformation with the cultural sector has led to speaking engagements on CNN, CBS, NPR, The New Yorker, and many more. And he's even received an Emmy. He's been honored by the American Alliance of Museums, the American Institute of Graphic Arts, and South by Southwest. And there's obviously way more to your resume. I'm not going to recite your whole resume here, but I would like to open the floor to you now, Josh. And he is here to present a newly developed talk for us today called Experience Design in a Socially Distant World. And I'll hand it off to you now.
Great. Thanks so much, Kristen. That was really fantastic. So this is so strange to me. I am sitting here actually in my office because we have reliable Wi-Fi. And I don't have like the feedback that I would normally have when I'm presenting to a group, but I'm trusting that you guys are there, and I'm looking forward to the questions. So experience design in a socially distant world. Let's talk a little bit about this. So here we go. This was Bluecadet before COVID. So as Kristen mentioned, there's about 60 of us. There's 45 of us in Philly. That's up there in the upper left-hand corner. That's actually very close to where I'm sitting. And then we have another 15 in New York. And we have this really wonderful interdisciplinary team. And a lot of what we do is working together, very in close collaboration, a lot of physical prototyping, a lot of prototyping around hardware. And we're also adapting to this world. This is a sort of a snapshot of some of the projects that we do. We do a fair amount of digital product work, some work that's on the web, but a lot of this work is experience design, a lot of work in museums, spanning content, architecture, design, creative technology, really trying to create like sort of holistic integrated experiences. Also looking a lot at things like AR, VR, emergent technologies. And this is some of the work that we did for the Henry Ford Museum. So I really am looking forward to when the museum reopens and people can see this stuff in person. But this also included doing this THF Connections app, which you can download and use from home. There's actually some really great at-home features, these really amazing interactive columns. And then a lot of work at the intersection of innovation is a exhibit, which I haven't gotten to see fully installed, and I'm actually incredibly looking forward to. This is sort of a snapshot of what that will look like. Why is anyone calling here? Sorry. And I'm sorry, I'm just gonna unplug the phone here. And this is actually one of the digital products that we produced for this, which was a giant touch table that actually is a collections viewer that uses both sort of a taxonomic exploration of the collection, but also uses AI, which was very cool. But yeah, so now this is what Bluecadet looks like. So a lot of us are on Zoom and we are very distributed. The world has definitely changed. And a lot of what we're thinking about now is, okay, well, how will the world look on the other side of this? And obviously I don't think we're at the end. I think we're kind of probably in the first quarter. But like, what will the world look like, and what will experience design look like when these institutions that we love reopen to the public? And to caveat, like I wanted to talk a little about what I used to say and what I used to talk about before all this happened. So I definitely had some very strong opinions about where museums were heading, and one of the things is we probably do maybe about half of our work now in museums. The other half is with sort of more brands, media companies, and there's definitely things that you observe outside of museums that you really wish that museums were picking up on, and things that are, I think, a little harder to observe in museums. So, one of the things, I was a little bit of a museum alarmist, honestly, and I, in that I would compare museums and rightly, in some cases, to some of these organizations and brands that basically collapsed when there was major disruptions in their category. So, Tower Records, obviously when music went digital and knowledge was ubiquitous around that content, Tower could no longer survive. Blockbuster, same thing. Once that content was available via VOD, once the brick and mortar couldn't survive, Borders, same thing happened with books, the distribution of that content. And what I was seeing was there was these major disruptions in the knowledge economy and the space economy. How people were using physical spaces and how people were distributing content and knowledge. And I did see that this was starting to affect some museums. There was the closure of the Philadelphia History Museum in Philadelphia, very close to my heart and home. But there was also the museum, which was this crazy, amazingly expensive undertaking in DC that closed. And it seems kind of like this trend could continue if museums didn't adapt. And again, we were also seeing some real innovation in the experience design space. So things like Meow Wolf, which I love, Museum of Ice Cream, which I don't. Things like Sleep No More, which is an immersive theater experience, which is also very fantastic to check out. Things like Team Lab, Borderless, or even some of the innovations we were seeing in retail with companies like Beta, which actually bought and reopened Toys R Us, and things like Camp, which is viewed here in the lower right-hand corner, which were just doing, they were all innovating and really thinking about how to kind of play with public space in a way that I wanted museums to start at least taking some inspiration from. And, you know, I was also looking a lot at the sort of the competition for knowledge. So one of my friends, Michael Nault over at the Art Institute of Chicago, put on my radar that they own American Gothic, which is this really amazing painting by Grant Wood. But Vox, which is a media brand, has like over 1.7 million views of American Gothic online and through their VOD channels. So what we were seeing is, like, even if you own this thing itself, you might not own the online conversation. And I think there was actually these points of tension that were kind of popping up more and more. Then what happened was COVID. And I started seeing things like this. And someone who spent like 20 years in the museum world, and like, I do that because I love museums. Like I feel very, very closely aligned to their vision, to their values, and to their people. I love working with people in museums. I give them a hard time sometimes, but this like really broke my heart, and it was really, really upsetting to see these museums taking a hit. I mean, obviously they weren't alone. I mean, Disney was looking to post a $3.4 billion loss this year, but museums were getting hit really, really hard. And, you know, honestly, I felt sort of like a dick for talking so critically of them and comparing them to Blockbuster. And, you know, it made me think, and I think as all of us are thinking about, like, how is the world going to be in this sort of post-COVID world, you know, where we've been taught and conditioned to fear one another, you know, where, you know, where lines and queuing experiences, which are crowds, you know, some things which are uncomfortable, like going on a crowded airline, but some things that were amazing, like going to concerts or, you know, just being around people, like those things are all they're gonna feel very different, particularly as things begin to reopen. And then things like the upper right-hand corner, which was an experience that we did for the Independent Seaport Museum. There's a lot of like haptic experiences, a lot of like touch experiences. This thing right here is something that you activate, and it is a physio-digital interactive that you blow into. I mean, in the age of COVID, like, is that cool? Like to have something that people are blowing into? You know, we're gonna have to look at these things through a new lens. And so, you know, I've been talking to a lot of friends and practitioners about this, and we're trying to figure out, like, okay, on the spectrum, you know, how are people going to react to this? You know, and obviously the reactions are going to change over time. You know, and some people were saying, like, this is like a hangover. You know, like when you're really hungover, you're like, I will never have a drink again in my life. I will not do it. You know, like I will not shake anyone's hand anymore. Like that, I'm an elbow bump guy now. Like, is that how things are going to be? I mean, you know, like, are we going to kind of like just revert back? You know, particularly if there's a second wave. Is it something that things are going to return mostly to normal, or is it more like this sort of like Pavlovian dog conditioning, where, you know, we are going to be deeply reprogrammed to how we want to interact for a good long time to come? And frankly, there's just a lot of uncertainty in this, and I'm not going to be able to come here and tell you where on the spectrum even I'm going to fall, let alone all these different industries or people at large. So what I've been suggesting to a lot of my museum clients and also just clients that operate a physical space is that they really should be looking at things basically in this Venn diagram. I love Venn diagrams, between things that are like likely will need to change. You know, like what are things that we know most likely people are not going to want to do, are going to have serious sensitivity to. What is like pragmatic and affordable? Museums are taking, and a lot of these public spaces are taking incredible financial hits right now. Like it's not the time to spend a lot of money. And like, what are known best practices? What are things that they probably should have been doing or kind of keying into before all this happened? And, you know, if it can meet all three criteria, then maybe this is really what you should prioritize. So I kind of have a couple different sort of pillars that I've identified. This is certainly not comprehensive, but it's a place to start. So one of the things I've been asking our clients to do, and one of the things that we've been helping with a lot, is auditing the experience. You know, looking at the museum experience, the experience in physical space, through the lens of a sort of post-COVID, and trying to figure out like when you're conditioned to social distancing, what feels right. So, for the National World War II Museum, we did over 80 of these touch screens in the upper left-hand corner that also uses this RFID technology. I'm concerned that I actually think the RFID trigger is something that makes a lot of sense. But I'd be concerned about how the touchscreens are going to be used, and then, like what is the cleaning protocol that has to go along with those? We did a 200 square foot touch wall for the National Air and Space Museum. Is that going to feel incredibly, is the way that it mediates space and asks people to exist together in space, is that going to be okay? And is a giant touch surface something that people are going to want? And then honestly, even things like this Connect experience, which is the upper right hand corner that we did for Field, it actually it forces people to bump into each other a lot. So even though it's a Connect experience, there's no interface. Is just the actions and the behaviors that it's encouraging, is that going to be okay? So, again, trying to look through these things through that lens and just sort of identify like where on the spectrum do we think these things are going to fall? And then also looking at the opportunities. So for the Field Museum, again, in the lower right-hand corner, we did a lot of this wayfinding with these touch screens, but we also built it on web technology, and we made it adaptable to mobile devices. So look at like where can you begin to reuse that or to invest in onboarding to experiences that we know people will be okay with in a socially distant world. The second pillar is this idea of experiential content strategy. So, and this is something that, again, I sort of talked about a little bit on that Vox example. But again, like here, I think that this is an opportunity for museums to really think, and for public spaces to think about what should exist in the physical and what should exist in the digital. Maybe people come to the museum to be in close proximity to these artifacts, to be really inspired, but do they then get most of that interpretation elsewhere? Does that interpretation happen offsite? Does it happen as part of the pre-visitation, the post-visitation? Is that pushed to other sort of devices and platforms? And one of the things I've also sort of criticized museums for is this idea of thinking of themselves as a building. So where their social, their editorial, their web, their apps are all geared towards driving visitation to the building, driving people into the building. The website is a marketing platform for the building. The apps are to enhance the building. Can they begin to think about, what we're seeing on the right-hand side, which is really kind of pushing the building out into the sort of tactical sphere, and really putting the user and the visitor and the content and the experiences that you can deliver to them in the center, and reorienting towards that. So maybe it's not as important that the visitor actually transacts through the building, but there might be other touch points, and that might also have to require some adjustments to their monetization strategy and where the point of purchase might actually happen, or where people end up contributing to the museum or to the public space in the future. And then also, I would say, taking a lot of inspiration what's happening now. One of the things I think is really fascinating about this point in time, which is in some ways it's like the ultimate control group. It's a data point that we never had before. You can see what's happening with the ozone layer, and we haven't had these levels of emissions for decades. But also, what do people do under these sort of conditions? And there's some amazing things happening right now. Travis Scott did this concert in Fortnite this week, and it had, these numbers are actually crazy. They had 27.7 million unique users to that experience, and over 45.8 million views. That was over 5 10-minute concerts in Fortnite. So you look at it and you're like, wow, that's some pretty extreme visitation. The National Air and Space Museum is one of the most trafficked museums in the country. I think they get between 7 and 9 million visitors a year. So you're like, wow, there's opportunities in these spaces, to create real engagement. things like Oliver Jeffers, who's like one of my absolute favorite people, children's book author. I have 2 young children, so like 2 of these references are for like young children. But he was doing readings of his storybooks via Instagram story. Tallest Man on Earth was doing covers by request via YouTube. There was this really fantastic social campaign. I don't know exactly where it originated, but where basically people were like dressing up like their favorite paintings. This was a online poetry conference hosted by Maria Popova, Brain Pickings, that was really well curated, or the Mo Willems Lunchtime Doodles, which was this really fantastic series that was put on by the Kennedy Center. So again, there's like just some really rich inspiration to be taken from this period. The other thing I would look at too is this idea of humans as technology. This is something that I've kind of been banging for a while. I think groups like Museum Hack have been doing this really well, trying to figure out like how do you enhance the visitation experience and mediate that visitation experience through people. So again, Museum Hack is being referenced here in the upper left-hand corner. In the upper right-hand corner is South by Southwest World, which was an activation at South by Southwest in, I think, 2017, which took a lot of cues from Sleep No More, but is really a piece of experiential theater. And then this is actually below are some storyboards for a corporate briefing center that we did, where it was really very heavily docent-led. So one of the things that's really advantageous about using people is that one, they can control a lot of they can, deliver a ton of content. They're incredibly responsive, particularly if they're well-trained, but then they can also sort of mediate some of the emerging rules of social distancing. And then also they're giving you a lot of firsthand observations and data points to make better decisions. And that kind of brings us into like my last kind of pillar here, which is this idea of like, who knows? I mean, honestly, who knows how people are going to react? And in that kind of chapter and moment of uncertainty, you really need the process by which you iterate and by which you adapt is more important than adopting any specific tactics. So one of the things that we've been really looking at is like thinking about prototyping. So these were on the left are some prototypes we did for the Henry Ford. But again, like, and all these are different prototypes, but how do you prototype the experience? How do you sort of like test and iterate and make sure that things that you're doing are working? How do you prototype existing experiences and test them to make sure that people like that they're okay and they're sort of conforming to new social norms? I think prototyping and iterating is going to be incredibly important in this sort of specific era. This is also just showing some behind the scenes stuff. Some prototyping that we did with AI for the Henry Ford table. I love this graphic on the left because this was actually done in conjunction with the curator. So it actually showed how kind of the curators made all these connections from an object throughout their whole collection. But then it also shows some of the things that we did with AI. And the thing that I would say is what's interesting about prototyping is it sometimes gets you to the core of what's interesting. So in this case, the output was this, incredibly, tactile multi-user experience. And, maybe the output is going to still hold up, maybe with a little bit of, spray and wipe, that people are going to still really want to do this. But I think what's really important is that if the underlying content, the underlying story is really strong then whatever that final output layer is can be adapted and iterated. I would also say, as part of the Henry Ford app, is also up for a Webby Award, so please vote for us. So that's like a little bit of a personal shout out, but also like download it. You can make your own little Wienermobile and place it in your home. So thank you, and I will now enjoy talking to someone besides my screen. Okay, Kristen, you there?
I am on my way back in. There we go.
Okay.
So much for that, Josh. That was amazing. There's a whole lot of speculation and sort of like, we don't know, but maybe this is the way it could go. So But you gave a keynote talk in 2018 for the AIGA, or American Institute of Graphic Arts, called The Future of Museums, which obviously, given the date, was pre-COVID-19. And I recently watched it and I was really struck by how eerily prescient some of the things you were talking about in that talk were, and how we're kind of experiencing a lot of those things on an accelerated scale. It's kind of like the Blockbuster Tower Records model, right?
Yeah.
I think the consensus for quite a while now in, experience design and museum, the intersection of those two fields, is that we need to stop thinking of digital as a secondary experience. We need to think of it as an integrated layer that can enhance the voices of artifacts, real artifacts in real spaces, but as this sort of like extra mapped layer into that narrative. And right now we're finding, like, thankfully, a lot of us have been making moves into that digital sphere. So I guess in this idea of, like, pushing at the boundaries of museum spaces and what those can be, thinking about museum spaces as being beyond brick and mortar and museum as temple, having sort of collective bodies experiencing things in a space. How do you see, like, play and, like, sort of creative play and real-time learning shifting in museum spaces in the future? I'm not asking you to predict the future, but
Oh no, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think how did Radiohead say it? Everything in its right place. I think part of it is really figuring out, what is the overall, experience of your audience with your content and your brand, and thinking about all these different places where that can manifest. So, like, where is the best place for those things to manifest? And, like, where is it most possible to manifest that content? So, for example, if you're talking about play, I mean, play is an amazing thing that you can do that in a museum with other people. Like that is a unique condition of a museum, something that you can uniquely encourage and design around in a space in a really interesting way. Delivering certain types of content, like video content, like that can happen in a lot of other places. That can happen via, social. It can happen over, VOD, like Netflix, or, set-top boxes. It can happen through apps. There's a lot of different ways to deliver that content. And also that content needs to be sort of repackaged for each of those platforms. So I think part of it is figuring out, like, where are the places that what is the content and experiences you want to deliver, and what's the most appropriate place to deliver them. But I think, honestly, I don't think that museums are great places necessarily to dump a ton of content. I think they're great places to have these really wonderful, inspiring, like, experiences, and then also sort of like to point out the rabbit holes that you can then travel down later. Those, like, points of knowledge. It's like things that you're like, oh my God, that's super interesting. And then, like, but making sure that the museum then, like, connects it for people, that they can then figure out a way to get to that content later, that they can, like, and then also, be part of that conversation going forward.
Sure, that connection point, I think, is a good one. It's
yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that was so rambling. I'm so sorry.
No. Sometimes we, and sometimes as, in museum professionals who are used to the objects we deal with every day, we presume a lot of knowledge in the world. And it's interesting to work with you guys to sort of take a step back and sort of be like, well, what's the best way to present the story?
Yeah.
I'll get back to that in a minute. But
can I actually follow up with that? Because I think that's super interesting. Because, one of the things that it's sort of funny, because, like, I had this conversation about the Mona Lisa, and, like, how everybody wants to be like, there's, like, this crazy selfie obsession with the Mona Lisa, and you're like, it's a nice painting, but, like, why? Like, why do people want to be photographed with it? And it's because it's developed so much, like, resonance everywhere else. Yeah. It's not like that thing is so amazingly magnetic on its own that, like, it draws you to it. It's a great painting. It's an amazing painting, but, like, there's other amazing paintings there. It's because of all that messaging and all that information, all that education that happens outside there that brings you there. So like, and, like, I don't think that you can necessarily take every object in the Henry Ford and give it that level of resonance. But I feel like it's sort of the job of the Henry Ford to build that resonance and build that story and anticipation outside of the museum. So when people come to there, they're like, oh, wow. Or if they get that spark there, that they can then, pick up that content elsewhere.
Absolutely. And sometimes it's even about exposing the resonances behind objects whose stories have been kind of, like, not as well told. It's
Totally.
Mode. I have to ask, though, based on where we are now, and working in the field that you do, you know, there are always these sort of new technologies, speculative technologies that people are playing around with behind the scenes. Are there any sort of examples of that that you can talk about where you could see some of those granular things that are starting to bubble up to the surface being accelerated because of where we are now?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I was really skeptical of AR at first. Um, like yeah, well, because it felt really gimmicky. I mean, this idea of like, oh, you know, here's my table, and then oh, there's a tiger on the table. Like, I was like, all right, like it didn't really, it didn't make a lot of sense to me. But actually, I took my son to Disney World like in the beginning of February, which was also a very interesting, you know, thing to think back to. You know, it wasn't that long ago, and he was playing Pokemon Go in Disney World, and which Pokemon Go is an AR app essentially. And what they'd done was they'd mapped all this content, all these Pokestops, all over Disney's IP. You know, so every piece of important IP and every like thing that was like a signature, you know, object or vista at Disneyland was suddenly mapped with this new content. And I was like, oh shit. I mean, sorry. I was like, AR is not about the visual. It's about localizing content in space. And like once you think about it that way, like it opens up so many opportunities. And there's you know, and you're like, well, and it doesn't need to be visual. It could be audio. It could be there's so many different ways that you can think about like layering content on physical space. And then also when you think about the opportunities for collaborative AR to have shared experiences, and also the idea of like creating content in AR, I think that's a really interesting. I think there's just some really interesting opportunities there.
Definitely. And we just had a question through, if I'm looking down, it's because I'm looking at questions, not
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Don't worry about that.
So we just had a question through that I think kind of relates to what we're on right now, which is how do you think touch gestures will evolve? Do you think there'll be more attraction to eye tracking or triggering by physical placement?
So one of the things that actually I've been talking about well before all this happened was like this idea of screen fatigue. So like Bluecadet has built so many touchscreens. Like we've done so many touchscreens, and I'm so sick of touchscreens. I think often they are like a curatorial vice, where like a curator, like they get their word count cut down on the tombstone labels, or like, you know, like they have all this like stuff they want to like jam into this exhibit, and they have no place to put it. So the touchscreens become these repositories of extra content and extra text. And like we're totally guilty of that. Like we've created some really, really useless touchscreens. And you know, the thing is that, but then sometimes those experiences are very valuable, like particularly if it's like more service design, if it's serving like a really unique experience. So all in all, I think it's a great time to just sort of evaluate whether touchscreens are worth doing or not. You know, and like whether they make sense. In terms of like eye tracking, those are very, like, you know, I think this all has to do with like the fidelity of interaction that you need. Like eye tracking is very hard. It's very hard to navigate an interface via eye tracking, or even the magic leap, you know, that kind of proximity tracking. You know, it's not something that's particularly tuned. It might evolve, but like it's not necessarily a great long-term solution. We've been doing a ton of work with proximity sensing and sensors. Like that's something that we always thought was like very important. And I think that like, and also things that are triggered, you know, via proximity, or through some sort of intermediary, like a Bluetooth, NFC, RFID, like some sort of object. I think that also has a lot of promise. So we're definitely exploring a lot of that stuff. I mean, we're actually going to be putting out a post in a few weeks. There's also a lot of materials that resist, you know, viruses and bacteria. So like there are other types of touch, capacitive touch, other techniques that we think that might be pretty interesting.
Sure. And I think, you know, we have another question up here that kind of relates, and it's from Jacqueline, and she says, I'm thinking about our ADA efforts with 3D tactile objects and tactile opportunities. And I know at the Henry Ford, we have a lot of touch-based tours and things. Where will those go post-COVID? How will we accommodate those who need tactile experiences to understand and experience content and concepts? So I think what you just said kind of relates to that, but do you have any thoughts on ADA and accessibility issues?
You know, it's actually really interesting. So when I was originally putting together this this deck or this presentation, I actually pulled a bunch of references to ADA because we actually we do have a staff member who focuses on that, who's in a wheelchair, and who's really opened our eyes to a lot of those ADA concerns and issues that I wish we were actually more attuned to before. But it's actually a very similar lens, you know, to view an experience through. You know, when he goes through a museum, he's looking at it through an accessibility lens, and it's been really interesting to view various experiences through that lens. But specifically around things that are tactile for people where there might be sight issues with sight. I don't think you can do away with those experiences. I mean, I think that you just have to make sure that they might just be about having cleaning protocols. And I think this is also where this idea of like leaning into docents and leading into people to help mediate those experiences is incredibly important. You know, I don't think you can just like sort of necessarily set it and forget it. But I do think that those experiences are really important. And you know, important to everyone, and very important to this to a subset. So I think that every effort should be made to maintain those.
Absolutely. I mean, sometimes a colleague of mine just said the other day, sometimes the solution is already in front of us, and sometimes we're already using it. We don't need to reinvent, you know, the wheel. So, and only time will tell, right? I mean, we like to think that we have to think that this is a temporary situation we're in, right?
Yeah. Well, and also sometimes people jump to the very technology-oriented solutions. Like, okay, well, it's going to be this like, you know, magic leap. You know, it's going to be these, you know, these like fake, like, you know, floating button holography. And it's like, no, it might be a squeeze bottle and a you know, you know, it's going to be a lot of Purell, you know, and it's going to be some people. Like, you know, like those in some ways, like Purell and people are more sophisticated technology than the magic leap. Or the it's not the Magic Leap. It's the I'm butchering the technology. Magic Leap is the AR app. It was
yeah. I think I know where you're
going. Oh, whatever.
It's okay. So I guess this is a tricky one, and I don't know.
Motion. Someone got it. Leap motion.
All right, so it's a tough one. Claudia asked this question. I think this is something very important for us to consider as we continue to move into digital realms and museum spaces. And she asks, what about reaching those who don't have the same digital opportunities? No smartphone, no internet access. I know in Detroit here in particular, you know, 40% of people don't have access to reliable internet. So how can the museum reach those audiences if the museum is closed or have limited access? Have you seen any good test models for how other institutions are approaching this problem?
You know, it's a really really important issue. I mean, honestly, like I'm in Philadelphia, which also has a huge issue with internet access. That's becoming a major thing. I think Comcast is doing some things to roll out more internet to some of these homes, but no, with the public libraries closing, that's a major issue. I think, you know, most cities have done pretty good research and there's pretty good data about the adoption of smartphones or technology in their communities. One of the things that we found was actually kind of surprising, at least initially, was that like smartphone penetration was like much better than desktop or internet. So, you know, in some ways it was like much more likely that someone might have like a really strong Android device, but no laptop, no computer. You know, they might have, or like possibly an iPhone. So in some ways, you know, people are like, oh, well, you know, the desktop is like a less sophisticated medium than the smartphone. So we're going to design for the desktop. And you're like, well, no, actually, really, if you want to reach them, you should be designing for the mobile devices first. And then you should also be thinking too about, you know, if there's issues with bandwidth. I mean, we've done a lot of work where our products have been rolled out internationally. So if you're rolling out a project, you know, like a mobile project to Africa, you have to think very much about, you know, bandwidth, download issues, optimizations. Also thinking about how to throttle content based on like testing downloads. So, you know, there's a lot in the craft of delivering content, you know, across to these different devices and efficiently. Like, yeah, it's just a horrible move to like force someone to use all their data on your giant image. That's decorative. That doesn't even do anything.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a tough question to answer, and hopefully maybe this is the moment where, you know, some of these larger companies that are internet providers can start to rethink their models too, right? That could effectively feed into the issues that we're facing in museums. So
Oh, 100%.
that's a very utopian view, but one can hope, right?
And then I, you know, and then I'd also go back. Like I'm deep in digital, but like by no means like do I think most like all solutions should be digital. So there's all these other different ways of, you know, delivering content. You know, it might be saying like, okay, well, they might not have a computer, but maybe they have like a Roku TV, you know, or a Netflix account, or you know, so the TV is where they get content, or maybe it's something that's like more printed. You know, maybe it's something that's not you know, that's not digitally tethered.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I actually experienced my very first like virtual cinema experience through like a small independent theater locally here in Detroit, and I had to access it in this very back end way through my Amazon Fire Stick.
Yeah, it
wasn't the best interface of a design, but I did get there, and it's interesting that we can continue to support, you know, those small groups as well.
No, absolutely.
So I wanted to shift just for a minute back onto some of the work that you did for the Henry Ford. So the Intersections of Innovation project that you did with us, this was like a multi-department effort involving so many different departments, like institution-wide. And it was a major thing for us. And I think in that process, one thing that I kept hearing about was how there was this sense of trust in having Bluecadet as partners, which I'm sure you're happy to hear. But a lot of staff who worked on that project talked about, you know, how there was this very egalitarian vibe, you know, voices were equalized, like any sense of ego was like scrapped at the door. And all of this was in the name of trying to present the best sense of the story, because ultimately as museum professionals, that's our job, right? We live in service of the stories we tell, and how do we best have those stories heard and told? So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the Bluecadet mindset, if there is one, and like how you do so well at cultivating this sense of openness among like working with multi-department internal groups, and then as an external partner coming in, if you could just like talk, like how do you do it?
I mean, you know, I mean, one, like it's incredibly heartening to hear. I love hearing that sort of stuff. Actually, Matt Elliott on your team was on a panel with one of my team members at the AAM conference, and you know, he referred to one of the projects as like, this was, yeah, like this is my app, this is my, and I was like, oh, that's like, you know, because we also think of it as ours, you know, but it's like no, it's there. It's like, it's both of ours. We both love this thing. You know, we both made this thing, and it's as much yours as ours. You know, and we like, and like, I think that idea that this thing's like co-created, and that, you know, like, it's all of ours. We're not like, we're not these like geniuses that you're just gonna like dump your content to, and we're gonna build something and, you know, bake it and deliver it back. Like it's a process of creating these things together. But I'd say like a lot of that is cultural, and a lot of that's process. I mean, you know, Bluecadet used to be my freelance handle back in the day. And like the blue, like, I mean, it was a Modest Mouse song, like, you know, that's where I got the name. But like, but the blue is like probably a nod to my politics. And the cadet was like, really was like, I just wanted to, like, we wanted to be in service, you know, like we just like wanted to like help, you know, and like, I hated seeing these like really high ego design studios, like that were just like treating themselves like these like very precious ateliers, you know, and like, you know, like, you know, you're this like great, impenetrable genius that will produce this work. And I just don't think, I mean, for us, like, you know, the real experts are the people on your team. Like, there's no way we could have generated that mind map with our team. And we have great content people, but like, there are people who live it and breathe it and love it. And like, it's up to us to figure out like how to like extract that information and then like collaborate to package that in an interesting way.
Definitely.
And that's where our best work comes from. And that's where the feedback loop kind of exists.
Yeah. And the things that spark off of those feedback loops can
exactly
give you away from where you started, but sometimes they're better in the end, right?
Oh yeah.
So in a lot of the process that we experienced with you're in Philly and New York, and we're in Detroit, and so there was a lot of back and forth through these sort of like digital collaborative tools, and everybody has their favorites. Some people haven't really even tried those, but they're a really great way to sort of like do this kind of rapid prototyping of information and knowledge from experts, and keeps us on our toes, keeps us working quickly so that like the ideas don't really die on the vine. And today we're suddenly finding ourselves, here we are on Zoom, and a lot of people have not had to use Zoom before now, and we're finding there's like this sort of plethora of tools available to us. But how do you think we can use, you know, this moment to sort of test and generate ideas and like find ways to creatively brainstorm together, you know, when we might not be so used to this kind of environment?
You know, it's really interesting. I mean, I said that, like, you know, we opened up the New York office about 5 years ago. And it was not, you know, it was basically, we just found some really, really talented people there that we wanted to work with. And we just thought, like, shared our values, and we just like personally like wanted, they felt like cadets, like we wanted them to be part of our team. But even then, like back then, it was a real struggle because we were all working on projects together, you know, even between Philadelphia and New York, and we, you know, travel on trains and be amongst each other. It was a struggle to figure out, like, how do you, you know, how do you like work digitally? How do you create those conversations? But we were kind of forced into it. So we learned a lot of things. And then like, this has been like a whole nother level, you know? So like now, like we're all distributed, and like, and frankly, you know, the fact that like, we can't just be like, we can't be like, oh, well, you know, like, I don't want to work with them because they're not in my office, or like, you know, like there's no choice, you know? So we like, so you adapt, and like, and I think it's through, you know, it's sort of back to what I was talking about, prototyping, is like, you know, through this sort of limitation of options, you know, you adapt and you learn how to do it. And then suddenly, sometimes you find stuff that like actually is working better. I mean, we had two big meetings last week at Bluecadet with like over like 60 people in them. Like giant multidisciplinary workshops that we were running, you know, through some of these like collaborative brainstorming tools. I will butcher them if I try to remember what they are. But like, you know, those tools are working great. And like, and honestly, like the team is producing really amazing work. But I think some of it is like, you look at it and like, this is a time of amazing adaptation, and there's like going to be some really interesting things that come out of this. And actually, I think, you know, even for us, like the way that we think about our office, you know, I was in the midst of like scouting out a giant new office for Bluecadet in Philly. And I'm like, now thinking, I'm like, well, you know, people are working really effectively from home. You know, how do we optimize the office here to serve that, you know, before we just, you know, scale, you know, more places that we expect people to be 9 to 5 or 6 to, you know.
Yeah, whenever our hours
are 5, whatever these guys.
What are hours? What are days?
10 to 6. I don't know.
What are hours yet? But
no, yeah. What are hours? Like, when do people work? You know, like what? Like totally.
Yeah. So I've noticed, I'm just skimming through the Q&A here, and I've noticed a couple questions come up about, you know, thoughts on like people speculating, like, what are we going to do about queue lines to get into museums? Because obviously, even when we do return, we're going to have to limit the amount of people that can go into any gallery or experience. So I guess maybe a sort of spin-off question of that would be like, how can we like engage people with one another without people just like staring down at their phones while they're like waiting to get into a space while they're standing in the line? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that, you know, I've been saying for a while that I think museums should be paying really close attention to themed entertainment. Because so not in the storytelling necessarily, and certainly not in the way that they treat, you know, content, but in the way that they deal with things like queuing. You know, like what Disney has been doing with Magic Band, and like how that's evolved over the years, and how they've done timed experiences, and how they've controlled the sort of the way they've rolled out their app, the way that they've sort of controlled the overall, you know, flow of the park. Like, there's a lot of lessons to be learned there. I think that honestly, I think that there's a lot of things that, like, you know, WeWork, you know, they're a troubled company, but they were doing a lot of things on spatial analytics, thinking about how people occupy spaces, how to move people across different spaces, you know, defining different spaces. There was a lot of interesting research coming out of WeWork. And there's some of these like really interesting best practices about the craft of experience design. That I would love for people to embrace, you know, like how do you choreograph the entire space so that people always have something to do and someplace to be, but that's not just like queuing them like cattle.
Sure, sure. Yeah, absolutely. It seems like everybody on the chat is agreeing that Disney's a good example of that kind of experience. So
Actually, Universal almost did it better. Like, you know, like it, yeah. But
yeah,
no, but totally, Disney's done a they've done an exceptional job.
right, right. And there's probably a lot that folks can do too with like pre-registration, pre-ticketing, you know, there's ways we don't know. We'll have to
No,
take it back.
and I think the trick, honestly, is like trying to figure out like where to take inspiration.
Yeah.
Um, so it was interesting, you know, like Trader Joe's, like they were way out ahead of Whole Foods, you know, and how they were doing it. And like honestly, like just even watching, like as an experience designer, watching Whole Foods, like how they've adapted over the last 6 weeks,
Yeah.
and just like seeing how like what's gone dark, where they've moved things, how things have shifted, how like you know like it's actually been it's been fascinating for me to watch, and I think that's sort of the thing is you have to kind of begin to like look at these spaces through like that sort of structural lens and figure out like okay like what are the things I can steal.
Right. Yeah. It's been kind of fascinating for all the wrong reasons, obviously, to kind of watch that evolution of like user experience and experience design evolve out of these like big box stores and even small scale stores, like going
Yeah.
into Target to shop first thing in the morning. It's like every time, I try to keep it down to like every 2 weeks, but every time I go, it's like there's new things to notice. And I think as museum professionals, we are probably looking at those cues and like finding like parallels to how those could work in our own spaces.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, honestly, it's been fascinating just watching my farmer's market has like adopted technology, you
Yeah,
know, like, and yeah, it's great to see actually, because I think it's actually making for better experiences.
exactly, exactly.
Sure.
All right, so let's see. I'm going to throw one more question out there, and then we will call it good. But there's obviously way too many questions.
If people want to like DM me like on like LinkedIn or whatever, like that's a great way to do it. Like it's like really the only social platform I'm actually active on. But yeah, I'd be happy to field other questions. You know.
Okay, that's good follow up for folks. And just to let everybody know too, we've noticed some sort of questions come through of like, will this talk be available afterwards? Yes, we will be able to share that with people. If you go over to our Facebook page, I believe there'll be a Facebook Live recording there. And again, just always feel free to come back to that the Henry Ford link that we popped at the beginning of the chat to check out some of these other experiences. So I guess like one sort of ending question, and this is from Michael. He asks, many museums need revenue, which they get through their buildings and in-person sort of visitors. How do you see the evolution of revenue generation with the creation of more digital-only content? Should we be concerned with this type of approach of revenue generation? Obviously, it's on a lot of museums' minds.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I think it's a great conversation to have. I don't have the total answer.
Yeah, it's
The person that I think actually, or the institution I think is doing a great job of this is the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. Jonah
yeah,
Wagenbach does amazing work down there. I mean, but they've always been really one they run profitably, which is amazing. But they've taken really interesting risks. They opened up a hotel that's like a World War II themed hotel.
wow.
Like it was like the #1 TripAdvisor rated hotel.
I guess I'm staying next time I go there.
Of course, no, it's amazing. It's amazing, and it's just like, but like you know, you just think about it. It's like it doesn't really matter that you know, like they're delivering content, they're delivering story, they're even delivering artifacts, they're delivering this experience that's like a truly well curated, thoughtful experience. But they're doing it in this way, and they're not insanely precious with their brand. And like also they think about, you know, I think part of the reason is because they have, you know, there's a lot of veterans who are not able to visit the World War II Museum in New Orleans right now. So they really look for ways to engage them, but they do a lot of really interesting things with travel, for example, you know, and these are all like crazily disrupted industries right now. But I think that the lesson is just to take is that like, if you think about it as like your user, if you think about it as your like if you think about the visitor more holistically as someone who can engage with your content or your story, there might be lots of ways to monetize that and engage meaningfully and like in a great, purposeful, authentic way that doesn't require them entering your building.
Yeah, sure, sure. Scalability is the key word.
Yeah, yeah.
So, yeah.
I could go on. It's great though. Yeah. Right. It's an important conversation.
Yeah, and we could all go on and on and on. So,
Yeah,
but
of course.
thank you so much for joining us today, Josh.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, this has been great. Thank you for being the first guest in our new series, and we hope to have more of these down the road. Just stay tuned in to the Henry Ford. We'll make announcements if there are more of these down the line. And in the meantime, this has been really fantastic, and I think you've given people a lot to think about today. And thanks for sharing Bluecadet's expertise and amazing amounts of knowledge.
All right, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Thanks, Kristen.
All right, thanks. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thanks so much. Bye.